기호 차 있지, 기호. 아, 가보자.
Kiedy jesteś blisko wszystkich naszych myśli, staje się realne.
At some point, the motorcade stopped and shots were fired. Russians tried to stop the motorcade with the president, so they fired a few shots, and now the convoy is turning back. When you listen to the voices of journalists who travelled on the bus accompanying the President of Georgia and the President of Poland, it is very clear that after hearing the shots, they were fully aware of the fact that something very important happened, something very dangerous for Poland, for the Polish President. We drove up to a place where, according to the plan of President Sarkozy, there should be no Russians. They had not left the place, and immediately we heard a series of shots from a machine gun. It was about 30 meters from me. If one believes the Ossetian authorities, the case is clear. Their soldiers fired warning shots and did not aim at the motorcade, but in the air. The question is just who ordered to shoot as the post. From which shots were fired is under illegal Russian control. Illegal because the Russians should be long gone from here. However, very quickly, not just in the Russian media, but also in the Polish media, a version of the events began to circulate, according to which someone else was responsible for the shots in the direction of the Polish and Georgian presidents, and not the Russians or those who depend on them. The Prime Minister visiting London suggested that it was the Georgians who put our president at risk. Of course, I ordered to prepare a detailed report on what really happened. Full responsibility for the course of the visit, primarily for the security, is borne by the hosts. What happened shows that the president is an irresponsible person. If it was an assassination attempt, I would say, like the visit, like the assassination, because it takes a blind sniper to miss a car from 30 meters. When bombs fell on Gori and other cities in Georgia, the Olympic Games were beginning in the capital of China, Beijing. Here is how Adam Bielan, then political advisor to President Lech Kaczynski, remembered those days. A lot of world leaders were there, so the date was chosen very well from the Russian point of view. It was a time when it was difficult to get a quick response from world leaders to what was happening.
Przywódców światowych na to, co się dzieje.
Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, I cancelled my holidays, which started 2 days ago. Actually, it hardly lasted an hour due to the situation in a country which is our strategic ally, that is, Georgia.
Sierpień jest tradycyjnie okresem.
Traditionally, August is a period of a holiday or vacation break at the European Parliament. Generally, a period in which most institutions, not just European ones, but also NATO, which are located in Brussels, work at half speed.
Funkcjonuje na pół gwizdka.
I came to Warsaw and will stay here as long as necessary. I am ready to take any action aimed at changing the current situation in Georgia, bringing peace there. But first of all, to respect the territorial integrity, not to mention the authorities of Georgia, as there are fears that the current operation is aimed at changing these authorities.
Władza Gruzji, ponieważ istnieje obawa, że obecna operacja ma na celu zmianę tych władz.
Oznaczało to,
It meant that President Lech Kaczynski began preparations for the trip of Central European country leaders to the Georgian capital, Tbilisi, to stop the Russian plans of invasion against Georgia with their presence.
powstrzymać rosyjskie plany inwazji na Gruzję.
Samolot najpierw wyleciał z Warszawy.
The plane first departed from Warsaw to the Baltic countries, returned to Warsaw, where the Polish delegation went on board and flew to, as far as I remember, to Crimea, to Simferopol, to take President Yushchenko and the First Lady of Georgia, that is, President Saakashvili's wife. Later, there was the famous dispute with the pilot who refused to land in Tbilisi. Hence, we landed in Azerbaijan, in the town of Ganja.
Myślę, że o to mogło chodzić właśnie.
I think this might have been the point, so that Lech Kaczynski and the presidents of Lithuania, Ukraine and the Prime Minister of Latvia, Godmanis, would not appear in Tbilisi at the time when they could appear.
Wtedy, kiedy mogli się pojawić.
Zależało nam na tym, żeby wstrząsnąć.
We wanted to shake up the public opinion and Western politicians to start the process of stopping Putin. In fact, the only leader to understand this at first was President Bush.
Przywódcą, który najszybciej to zrozumiał, był prezydent Bush. Gdy okazało się, że Tusk...
When it turned out that Tusk and Sikorski and their subordinates refused to provide a plane for the president, we relayed it to the American side. They declared that in such a situation, Air Force 2 will be available.
Że w takiej sytuacji
It is important that this was not only a visit of the President of Poland, but from the very beginning it was known that the presidents of other countries would partake in this trip: 3 Baltic states and the President of Ukraine.
3 krajów bałtyckich i prezydent Ukrainy.
Jednym z pierwszych partnerów,
One of the first partners with whom Lech Kaczynski consulted the plans of his trip was Viktor Yushchenko.
Lech oddzwonił i mówi:
Lech called back and said,
Adamkus nie ma czym lecieć.
Adamkus has no plane to fly
Dzwoni
with.
do mnie i mówi: lecimy najpierw z
Then he
Warszawy
calls
do
me
Wilna,
and says,
zabieramy prezydenta
first we
i potem
fly,
z Wilna
first from
lecimy
Warsaw to
na
Vilnius, take the president, and then from Vilnius we fly to Ukraine.
Swój stosunek do aktywności prezydenta Lecha Kaczyńskiego premier Donald Tusk
Prime Minister Donald Tusk presented his attitude towards the activity of President Lech Kaczynski at this press conference. I will warn everyone against excessive excitement concerning certain initiatives and statements. I am certain that Mr. President Lech Kaczynski will respect and share this way of thinking. Concerning the possible trip of President Lech Kaczynski to Georgia, we will want to have certainty that such missions will be preceded by a wise analysis, which will result in the conviction, or at least the serious hope, that such a trip, such a mission, will really help the Georgians and all parties of the conflict to relieve tensions and stop the conflict from escalating. That's why we are surely going to discuss it further. Today, the team we established together with the President relieve the tension and help all parties to the conflict. There were no 2 equal parties in this conflict. It was Georgia that was invaded by Russia. Yet speaking these words, Prime Minister Donald Tusk was aware that a possible political operation that President Lech Kaczynski intended to carry out would foil Vladimir Putin's plans. Prime Minister Donald Tusk, making this declaration, was then waiting for a response to the letter he sent 2 months earlier to Vladimir Putin.
Wypowiadający te
Prime
słowa
Minister
premier
Donald
Donald
Tusk, making this declaration, was then waiting for a response to the letter he sent 2 months earlier to Vladimir Putin. The newly elected Russian Prime Minister is the recipient of the Polish Prime Minister's letter, in which he writes that he found their earlier meeting in February that very year positive. Let us recall this meeting, during which Vladimir Putin supposedly offered the Polish Prime Minister an offer of a joint partition of Ukraine. I consider the conversation with you that took place at that time to be successful and extremely important for the further development of relations between our two countries. Let me express my conviction that our open, substantive meeting contributed to the strengthening of the atmosphere, understanding and trust between Polish and Russian government decision-making centres. In your statements, I noticed both striving to seek mutually beneficial solutions on all levels of contacts, as well as a readiness to take up difficult topics with consideration to the sensitivity of the Polish side. In the letter, Donald Tusk painted a wide scope of cooperation between Poland and Russia and invites Vladimir Putin to visit Poland. It's hardly surprising that Donald Tusk is not enthusiastic about Lech Kaczynski's plans, which oppose Vladimir Putin's imperial policy. It is impossible to address in detail all the issues we consider important for the future of our relations in a letter. I merely wanted to indicate those among them which I believe are pivotal for the further development of Polish-Russian and EU-Russian relations. I would like both of us to be able to contribute together to their prompt and positive resolution. Our further meetings will provide an opportunity for that, both bilaterally and on the occasion of international projects with our participation. I would thus like to renew my invitation for you to visit Poland. It results from the whole series of documents to which I had access both at the Foreign Ministry and the archives of the Chancellery of the Prime Minister. That the letter was prepared primarily by Agnieszka Wielowieska, that is, the Director of the Foreign Affairs Department of the Prime Minister's Chancellery. 3 versions of this letter were kept, the handwritten amendments, bearing the seal of Agnieszka Wielowieska. She is the one to finally submit the last signed version of Donald Tusk's letter to Jarosław Bartkiewicz, head of the Eastern Department of the Foreign Ministry, with a request to send the letter to its addressee. Regardless of that, the letter was also sent to the Polish embassy in Moscow through diplomatic channels.
Dyplomatycznym również list został skierowany do polskiej placówki w Moskwie.
Dopiero w momencie, kiedy
Only
Amerykanie
at the moment when the Americans declared that in case of logistical problems in Poland, they would send us Air Force 2, Tusk yielded and suddenly the plane was found.
No ale samolot nie był
But it was
pusty,
not
był
empty.
tam
It also contained a present, in the form, the presence of Minister Sikorski, as a chaperone. The presence of Minister Sikorski will be one of the guarantees that this mission will bring about no political surprises. As the Prime Minister explains, it is about relations with Russia. Poland should not be the EU member state with the worst relations with Russia. The diplomatic mission of the President has the support of George Bush, who called Lech Kaczynski last night on the phone. In Tbilisi, the Polish President will talk to Nicolas Sarkozy. The French President is flying to Georgia straight from Moscow. The French President, Nicolas Sarkozy, is accompanied in the mission by Bernard-Henri Lévy, a French philosopher and documentarian. I am certain, however, that we did not act towards Russia then as we act towards Russia today. Thank God. Our support for Georgia, if you think about it, was actually minor. Nicolas Sarkozy prevented the worst, there is no doubt about it. He prevented a global invasion, massacre and a bloody slaughter.
Jednak ukaranie za
Punishment
użycie
for the
sił
use of armed
zbrojnej,
forces respecting borders, evacuation from occupied territories
terenów
was
okupowanych
actually not demanded.
tego w istocie nie zażądano. Zażądać to nie oznacza tylko
Demanding
grzecznie
does not mean
poprosić
merely
dyktatora.
politely asking a dictator.
Zażądać
Demanding
to znaczy
means to force,
wymusić,
strengthen, and actually
wzmocnić i
assist,
faktycznie
which we did not
wspomóc,
do.
czego nie zrobiliśmy.
We believe that Nicolas Sarkozy's first visit as a representative of the country, which presided over the EU, must first take place in Georgia,
Przewodniczącym
not
Unii
in Russia.
Europejskiej
It seems we had to simply accept in Georgia some of Russia's ultimatum. This was
wyglądało
a
na to, że
scandal.
musieliśmy po prostu zaakceptować w Gruzji niektóre ultimata Rosji. To był skandal.
І це було скандально.
Mimo podpisania tego
Despite the signing
porozumienia,
of this agreement, the
to
Russian tank
silniki
engines were
czołgów
working at
rosyjskich
full
pracowały
power.
pełną parą.
Only after
Dopiero
the
po
night rally
tym nocnym
did Putin
wiecu,
issue the
wieczornym
order to
wiecu,
stop.
dopiero wtedy Putin wydał rozkaz stop.
I perfectly remembered Lech Kaczynski's speech. It was a great speech. He was one of those who predicted what would happen.
Był jednym z tych, którzy przewidzieli to, co się wydarzy.
He was one of those who understood in advance that Putin's method of ruling was based on
Rządzenia
war.
Putina opiera się na wojnie. Polega na
Comprises of starting wars, multiplying wars, instigating one war after another, killing Chechens, hanging Saakashvili by his balls. It was the time when in the Duma, in the Kremlin, they were pondering on how long it would
To był ten czas, kiedy w Dumie czy na
theoretically
Kremlu
take
zastanawiano się
You know
nad tym,
this.
ile czasu teoretycznie zajmie dotarcie do Warszawy. Pan o tym wie. Prezydent Polski w tamtym czasie myślał
The Polish
w sposób
president
trzeźwy,
at
widział,
that
co
time
będzie
was
się
thinking
działo.
soberly.
Kilkoro innych
saw what
intelektualiści,
would happen.
pisarze,
As
rosyjscy
did several
dysydenci,
other
odważni
intellectuals,
dziennikarze
writers,
także.
Russian
Ale jednak
dissidents,
byliśmy
as well
bardzo
as great
osamotnieni.
journalists.
Nikt nie chciał tego
Still,
słuchać.
We were very lonely. Nobody wanted to listen to this.
Jesteśmy tutaj przywódcy
We are here, the leaders of 5 countries: Poland, Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania.
Jesteśmy po to, żeby podjąć walkę.
We are here to take up the fight.
Po raz pierwszy od dłuższego czasu
For the first time in a long time,
sąsiedzi
our neighbours from the north,
dla nas,
for us
także z
also from the
północy, ze
north,
wschodu,
from the east, have
pokazali
showed a face
twarz,
we
którą
have known
znamy od
for hundreds of
setek lat.
years.
Ci sąsiedzi uważają,
These neighbours
że narody
think that
wokół
the
nich
nations around them should be
powinny
subordinated
podlegać.
to
My
them.
mówimy nie.
We say no.
Ten kraj to Rosja.
That country is Russia.
Ten kraj
This country believes that the former times of the empire fallen almost 20 years ago are coming back.
i my też świetnie wiemy,
And we also know very well that today Georgia, tomorrow Ukraine, the day after tomorrow the Baltic states, and later maybe the time will come for my country, Poland.
Gdyby nie tamta decyzja
If not for
prezydenta
that decision of
Kaczyńskiego,
President
że
Kaczynski to come to Tbilisi to stand arm in arm with his friend, Michał Saakashvili would have hung dead in the same parliament building where, later that evening, the presidents of the European Union stood together. President Kaczynski saved the sovereignty of Georgia on
Po
that
tym
day.
wiecu udaliśmy się do
After this rally, we went to a
znanej
restaurant,
restauracji w centrum,
a well-known restaurant in the center of Tbilisi,
z pięknym
with a beautiful
widokiem
view
na
of the old
Starówkę.
town.
Restauracja, jedliśmy na tarasie, dużym, wielkim tarasie z pięknym widokiem.
We
na
ate on a
Starówkę.
large, enormous terrace with a beautiful view of the old town.
No, z wszystkich schodził stres oczywiście.
We were all
Przede wszystkim
relieved of
schodził
stress.
z prezydenta Saakaszwilego,
Of course, first of all,
na którego
President
tego dnia był
Saakaszvili
zamach.
was
Natomiast,
assaulted
no,
on that
w
day was
trakcie tej
relieved.
kolacji doszło do bardzo nieprzyjemnego
During this
incydentu,
dinner, however, a very unpleasant incident occurred.
gdy prezydenci
While other presidents and ministers were wondering what could be done in this particular situation, on how to protect Georgia against losing a significant part of its territory, suddenly Minister Sikorski became playful, started criticizing, shouting at President Kaczynski. So there was a risk of a diplomatic scandal, and the president asked me and Minister Kovnacki, who then was the head of the chancellery, if I remember right, to take Minister Sikorski for a walk, so that he cools down a little instead of making things worse, or the situation more tense.
Żeby troszeczkę ochłonął i żeby nie doszło do pogorszenia, zaostrzenia sytuacji.
I co, i zabraliście?
And did you take the minister for a walk?
Wzięliśmy pana ministra na spacer i
We took the minister for a walk. Next to the tables where we ate, there was a large terrace where there was no furniture, and we used it as a walking ground. Thus, we paced around for over 20 minutes, talking about life, about the life of Georgia's beautiful capital, about the beautiful sky full of stars. I got the task to alleviate it.
Dostałem zadanie, żeby to załagodzić.
Jakoś pan minister...
Did Minister Sikorski refer to this later, or somehow? Or did he consider the situation had never
Nie
happened?
chwaląc się, misję wykonałem.
No. Without bragging, I did my job.
Rządzący wówczas...
The politicians who ruled Georgia at that time see three factors for which Russia ultimately failed to swallow all of Georgia: change its government and damage the independence of this country. What saved Georgia were three contributing factors. First, the Georgian people's unity led by President Saakaszvili and resistance of the Georgian army, with small but quite effective forces. It is a fact that a large company of General Shulev, commander of the 58th Army, was completely destroyed by our small unit. There's even a movie about it. A documentary made by the Russians themselves. We fought and we resisted. President Saakaszvili was first offered transportation by the West to get out of Georgia. And Saakaszvili said, as later also President Zelensky heroically said, that he did not need a lift, but your support. That is first. Second, we always remember and appreciate the late President Kaczynski, who managed to gather the closest friends in Georgia. The President of Ukraine and the Presidents of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. And they came to Tbilisi in the middle of the conflict. And they stood together with President Saakaszvili and us. I was there too, on the stage, speaking to Georgians in the middle of Tbilisi. Even though that place was also a target, they were not afraid. They said they were there for the Georgians, and we are in solidarity with the Georgians. Georgia, as a country, is not forgotten. We know you are fighting, and we are with you. It was a big deal. We will never forget that. And we thank President Kaczynski and the other leaders very much.
To była wielka sprawa. Nigdy tego nie zapomnimy. I bardzo dziękujemy prezydentowi Kaczyńskiemu i innym przywódcom. Trzeci czynnik to bezpośrednie zaangażowanie USA.
That's what stopped them from entering Tbilisi. This is no longer the year 1968 and the invasion of Czechoslovakia, when a great power invaded a small neighbour and overthrew its government. The free world will now have to face the deep consequences of this Russian aggression against their neighbour for security in the region and beyond.
Okazało się jednak, że entuzjastyczne
It
oceny
turned
tej
out,
wizyty,
however,
jakich
that the
dokonali
enthusiastic
politycy
views of this visit made by politicians in Georgia were extremely different from those of a significant part of politicians in Poland. Within the government, we were quite sceptical about this plan, which was born at the last minute. The plan of President Kaczynski's trip to Georgia, sceptically for Poland not to be perceived as the country which is party to this conflict. For the time being, this war rhetoric that the president was using at the rally is worrying, because it also limits the room for manoeuvres for our foreign and security policies. Well, after all, a medium-sized country significant in the region, which Poland is, should keep open various channels of communication, also communication channels with Russia. Things become bad if the president of Poland becomes the leader of an anti-Russian movement. It would be good if the president's position referred to a movement for peace in Georgia and for respecting the rights and freedoms of the whole Georgia's integrity. This is a good position, yet the president left this position and moved to a completely different one, standing at the forefront of an anti-Russian movement. After the Russian aggression on Georgia, the details of a visit planned long before were being fine-tuned at the Polish Foreign Ministry. At the ministry, the Russian aggression and the victims on the Georgian side did not interrupt the preparations for a visit of an important guest.
Ważnego gościa.
The Russian attack on Georgia raises a strange reaction of Polish diplomats. They start analysing and checking themselves whether the Russian side would not want to resign from Lavrov's visit on their own. This information was premature and inaccurate. I can just say that the Russian side has not cancelled this visit, and we are still counting on Sergei Lavrov visiting Warsaw. He is certainly welcome here. There are numerous issues that can be discussed, and even should be discussed with the Russian Federation. Mr. Minister, so how about this visit? Has it been cancelled or not? Let me tell you honestly that we do not know about that at the moment. As yesterday morning, indeed, such a message was sent to the Foreign Ministry. But it seems there may have been a misunderstanding between a Polish diplomat and an official of the Foreign Ministry. If it turns out to be true, we will be very glad, because we would like Minister Lavrov to come to Poland as planned. Well, because it is true that the situation is tense at the moment, but by September, it may have clarified. The Russians, so to say, are playing the Poles about this issue in a tough manner, in the meaning that the Polish diplomatic mission in Moscow is simply trying to find out if Sergei Lavrov will want to come at all. And the Russians say yes, of course. The Polish side keeps the invitation open. Then Minister Lavrov is planning to visit Poland, as agreed early September 2008. But TVN and public television and some of the press are starting to speak, to doubt Lavrov's visit to Poland. The Foreign Ministry of the Russian Federation suggests to the Polish side that the Polish ministry tame these media.
Rosyjski MSZ nie będzie dementować
informacji will not deny the information given by Polish media about the alleged cancellation of Lavrov's visit, because it believes that it is the Polish ministry that should do so. The situation should be considered complex. Nevertheless, the Russian Foreign Ministry and the presidential administration clearly strive at keeping the situation under control and to finding a constructive resolution of the current state of affairs, unfortunate for the Republic of Poland and the Russian Federation. An urgent statement of the Polish Foreign Ministry would be important, explaining the situation as well as urgently preventing TVN and TVP from disseminating false information about Lavrov's visit. Sergei Lavrov's arrival in Warsaw was a consequence of an invitation extended at the beginning of the year, when Radosław Sikorski was in Moscow. Nothing has changed since Russia attacked Georgia, shelling its territory and driving tanks into the country. The meeting that took place here in Warsaw meant not only protocol discussions at the Foreign Ministry headquarters, but also informal meetings, such as a lavish party organised here in the Royal Łazienki Park at the Belvedere restaurant.
The
Polish Foreign Minister and Prime Minister were fully aware that hosting Sergei Lavrov, the head of the Russian diplomacy, with full honours a month after his country invaded Georgia meant granting him political acceptance of the Russian policy of aggression. This is evidenced by the document prepared by a graduate of the Moscow MGIMO School, which is the Russian forge of intelligence and diplomatic staff, Jarosław Bartkiewicz, head of the Eastern Department of the Foreign Ministry of the Republic of Poland. It should be deemed that Moscow treats the first foreign visit of the head of Russian diplomacy to a European capital after the events in Georgia as the beginning of a serious discussion on the future of Russia's relations with the West. The Russian foreign minister visiting Warsaw at the time of vigorous actions of the French presidency to regulate the Georgian-Russian conflict contributes significantly to raising Poland's authority among the EU member states. This document, formulated in that manner, clearly demonstrates that Poland's goal was to convince the Russian Federation that Poland certainly did not consider any form of sanctions. It was not thinking about excluding the Russian Federation in any way from dialogue and international diplomatic circulation. This is shocking, as Russia had just waged a war, the first such war against the country that was in an official dialogue with the European Union and on the path to joining NATO. Yet it is not just a matter of anticipation of what was decided in advance. A memo drafted after this visit clearly shows that Sergei Lavrov talked about just this with the Prime Minister of the Republic of Poland, Donald Tusk.
Rozmawiał Sergiej Ławrow z premierem Rzeczpospolitej Polskiej, Donaldem Tuskiem.
Prime Minister Tusk confirmed that despite the dynamic international situation conditioned by the Russian-Georgian conflict, the Polish side desires to maintain good relations with Russia. He emphasized that Poland would also like to make a positive contribution to improving relations between the EU and Russia. Poland then strengthened Russia with this visit by allowing it? Yes, definitely. It provided it credibility because, in fact, knowing what kind of a leader Poland is, how it is perceived by Russia, how it is perceived by the world as a supporter and promoter of the Ukrainian cause now, then only Poland can give credibility to Russia in difficult situations.
Promotor sprawy ukraińskiej, to w trudnych sytuacjach Rosję uwiarygodnić może tylko Polska.
This generally places the whole reset policy in a light, which we may have not even realized. Would this grand reset, without a previous Polish reset, even be possible?
Nie.
Since the outbreak of the war in Georgia, Poland has been the first EU country to be visited by one of the most important Russian politicians. A very important visit, certainly formulating a part of Russian strategy towards the whole Western world. Russia finally considered Poland, after many years, as a part of the Western world, a part that matters. Before that, Poland was the Black Peter, right? Black people in the European Union in Russian policy, depicted as the most vicious anti-Russian country. Today, we see that Russian diplomacy wants to assign such a role to British diplomacy and offers some kind of talks to Poland. Well, it is important that Poland is not really considered a Russia-phobic country by the rest of the world. The previously announced visit is carried out. Well, so at some level Russia wants to keep up a dialogue.
Z punktu widzenia Rosji wizyta była niewątpliwym
From the
sukcesem.
Russian point of
Niecały
view, this
miesiąc
visit was
po
undoubtedly a
ataku
success.
na Gruzję, po
In less than a
wizycie
month
szefa
after the
NBZ
Russian attack on
państw Unii
Georgia,
Europejskiej
after a
i
visit
NATO,
of the Russian foreign
nikt nie
minister
mógł
to
mówić,
an
że
EU and
Federacja
NATO
Rosyjska
member
w
state,
jakikolwiek
no one could
sposób
say
przez
that the Russian
państwa
Federation
Zachodu
is in
poddana
any
jest
way isolated by the
izolacji.
West. Another scandal breaks out in mid-October, sponsored by the chancellery of the Prime Minister Tusk. President Lech Kaczynski is going to the European Council summit, but the head of the Prime Minister's chancellery, Tomasz Arabski, informs the head of state that the president has no right, may not use the government plane to fly to the summit. We may give away a finger, palm, forearm and arm, but we cannot cut off the duties and the range of tasks imposed on the Prime Minister of the Constitution. Mr. President, I'm down on my knees before you and please let go. Please do not go. The Prime Minister played really ugly. I'm afraid that tomorrow, for example, Deputy Prime Minister Cetina may take away the President's car and security guards. May he just happily land and take off normally. The decision on the refusal to make the aircraft available to the President of the Republic was taken by Tomasz Arabski, head of the Prime Minister's Chancellery. In his letter to the President's Chancellery, he wrote as follows. Authorized by the head of the Chancellery of the Prime Minister, Tomasz Arabski, in response to the letter, I kindly inform that a delegation of the Republic of Poland in the composition stipulated by the Prime Minister departed for the meeting of the European Council yesterday. Thus, I consider the motion unjustified. Earlier, Tomasz Arabski argued the following way. I am sorry to mention that the notification on the need to use special military aircraft transport for the route Warsaw-Brussels-Warsaw on the 14th to the 16th of October this year may not be realised due to the need to assure one Tu-154M aircraft for operational use of the 36th Special Aviation Regiment, and the need to provide transportation for the Polish delegation presided by the Prime Minister at the European Council meeting. Moreover, I informed that the Tu-154M aircraft will be at the disposal of the delegation in Brussels from the 14th to the 16th of October this year. Tomasz Arabski said something completely different when the auditors of the Supreme Audit Office asked him questions. He then said that the refusal was based on a dispute on competence. Here's the contents of that hearing. On what basis did you decide that you were the competent authority to make a decision on this matter? He testified. As far as I remember, your question concerns the situation of departure to Brussels. The issue of departure to Brussels was not related to the execution of the agreement, but to the competence disputed between the Council of Ministers and the President of the Republic of Poland. I don't remember the details of that case. In the report, the Supreme Audit Office raised these arguments to the ground. Here are the fragments of the report. In one case, the head of the Prime Minister's Chancellery declined the right to use the special military aircraft transport to an entitled entity, that is the President of the Republic of Poland, after the President's Chancellery filed to the head of the Prime Minister's Chancellery notification on October the 15th, 2008, the need to use two YAK-40 aircraft due to the planned flight of the President at Brussels. The refusal was in spite of the 36th Special Aviation Regiment had aircraft ready to carry out such a task. The head of the Prime Minister's Chancellery considered this notification unjustified, even though the pursuant to the agreement, he had no grounds for such a refusal. In his explanations of the situation, the Prime Minister's Chancellery had indicated that in this case his decision was taken not based on the agreement, but due to constitutional doubts concerning the representation of Poland in the European Council. Yet another version of the same story was told by Tomasz Arabski, told when he was interrogated by the Lasek Commission investigating the cause of the Smolensk catastrophe in the time of Donald Tusk. It was a so-called political project, a well-known case about who goes to Brussels. Paradoxically, it was the only time I received a document concerning the President-Chancellery's expectation that he would fly to Brussels on the plane we had booked before that. And of course, I knew from the beginning that this project was very difficult and associated solely with the politics and the media coverage of who takes whose aircraft. And that was part of a political debate, so to say, between the authorities. 4 different stories about this event, and actually none of them were true. However, it was Donald Tusk, the boss of Tomasz Arabski, who reached the heights. Testifying in the Smolensk trial in 2018, when he spoke about what Tomasz Arabski did and did not do, he even stated that there were no entities at the Prime Minister's Chancellery dealing with the organisation of the Prime Minister's flights. Who was responsible at your Chancellery for organising the flight? I know he is responsible for the different parts of the visit. I am asking about the flight, specifically. I believe that the regiment was responsible for organising the flight. I was not interested in who was responsible for organising the flight. And at your Chancellery? At my Chancellery, there was no unit dealing with the aircraft and fuel or airfields, so it is a difficult question for me to answer. At the Chancellery, my closest associate in organisational matters, the head of the Chancellery, was, of course, Tomasz Arabski. However, I would not like, Your Honour, to create the impression that from the fact that I know that Minister Arabski was the head of the Chancellery, so the most important official at my Chancellery, to think, therefore, that he organised the flight as such, because, in my opinion, it would be a distortion of what I'm saying. Ultimately, President Lech Kaczynski flew to the European Council meeting on a plane chartered from LOT Polish Airlines. At the time, when Tomasz Arabski was denying President Lech Kaczynski the right to use the plane, Donald Tusk said these shameful words in Brussels. Mr. Prime Minister, do you need the plane for this work here? To put it bluntly, I do not need the President. This is the problem. First, Tu-154 was denied, and then this morning also YAK-40, flying coffin, as some say. So you had to take a charter plane. Please judge it yourself. For me, it is just ridiculous, but I'd rather Poland was ruled by people with a certain type of behaviour. I think Poland deserves it. Will you shake Donald Tusk's hand today? That actually is not a problem for me. I had to shake Mr. Kiszczak's hand under certain circumstances. So why not shake hands with Mr. Donald Tusk? The whole situation went down in Polish political history as the dispute over chairs or the dispute over a plane. But nothing could be more misleading. It was actually a fundamental dispute about Polish security and the Polish foreign policy concept. President Lech Kaczynski saw Polish security as part of the security of the countries of the region against the threat coming from the Russian Federation. The concept was about building a European community, but in a transatlantic sense, with the US. Donald Tusk saw Polish foreign policy as a part of the German-French duo, which at that time agreed in virtually all matters with the Russian Federation. It is about the interest of the state, which is clearly infringed. Please remember, though, that I am deeply convinced that the current government carries out a wrong foreign policy, that the policy of stressing the relations with our friends from Lithuania, Czech Republic and Ukraine, despite the difficult situation there, from Georgia, Latvia and Estonia, that the policy of demonstrating goodwill towards countries which hold no goodwill towards Poland makes completely no sense. That the policy of increasing the mass of influence of a certain state to the east of the European Union. In the European Union, the influence is very significant anyway. Now Poland is increasing the mass of that influence. It is a deadly policy from the point of view of both Poland and of Europe. An encrypted cable sent from Moscow from the military attaché early August to the Defense Ministry demonstrates how well the Russians treated Prime Minister Donald Tusk and how President Lech Kaczynski was treated.
Został na początku sierpnia do Ministerstwa Obrony Narodowej.
Significantly, Donald Tusk said on May the 23rd that Russia is a strategically important neighbour for Warsaw and that the development of relations with the Russian Federation, as before, shall remain a priority for his government. It has become obvious that the normalisation of relations has slowed down a little. The relations are stalled at a cool, neutral level. On the one hand, the coolness of the era of the dictatorial tandem of the Kaczynski brothers was overcome. The real warming, which had seemed real in February, did not happen. Statements of Lech Kaczynski are a completely uncontrolled factor, sometimes becoming a reason for serious irritation to Moscow. To neutralise them, counter-statements by Donald Tusk or semi-formal signals from the Foreign Ministry and the government that they will not be guided by such statements would be possible, for example. The essence of the Russian game against Poland at that time was to maintain and fuel the conflict between Donald Tusk as Prime Minister and Poland's President Lech Kaczynski. And Donald Tusk knew perfectly well that such concept of Russian policy was being realised towards Poland. Knew perfectly well? How did he know? He knew because he was informed about it. He was informed.
Był o tym informowany.
Czy to znaczy, że
Does this mean that Donald Tusk had the source information that the Russians were playing on Donald Tusk's conflict with Lech Kaczynski and that he was still entering this conflict? Yes, Prime Minister Donald Tusk and his political acolytes in Poland actually participated in the realisation of the Russian scenario, whose stake was to decompose Polish politics. A decomposition of the Polish political scene and disavowing President Lech Kaczynski, both in domestic politics and internationally. Very detailed information on this subject was also addressed to Prime Minister Tusk.
Bardzo szczegółowe były również kierowane do premiera Tuska.
When the president of Georgia invited President Lech Kaczynski on the anniversary of the Rose Revolution, the plan of this visit comprised, among other things, purely political issues related to what happened a few months earlier, when Russia invaded Georgia. The peace plan between Dmitry Medvedev, Nicolas Sarkozy and Mikhail Saakashvili assumed that at the place where the Polish and Georgian presidents were planning to go, there should be no soldiers of the Russian or Ossetian side at all. However, when the president's column began approaching the post, shots were fired in the direction of the presidents and their companions.
Prezydentów i towarzyszących im osób padły strzały.
If you listen to what was going on inside the bus on which the journalists were travelling, you can hear and see perfectly clear that the participants of this trip were fully aware that something important has happened, but also that something really dangerous has happened. They fired a few shots, and now, at this point, the convoy is turning back. No, don't say anything about the president. Why not? You know where he is? At a certain moment, driving on a mountain road, the whole convoy stopped. We are at the Ossetian border. From our part, we need to say that it was, I don't know, the president's security detail or Saakashvili's security. Some guys jumped out, and in this, the Russians tried to stop the column with the presidents. At that point, the column turns back. Yes, I'm sure of what I'm saying. I don't know, check other media maybe. They are already broadcasting. This lady from Radio Z is already broadcasting, and something else. See more or less what's going on there. At a certain moment, the column stopped and shots were fired. It turned back and is now going back to Tbilisi. It is worse here in these mountains, because no one fucking knows if there aren't any snipers sitting here. Fuck knows. They are standing, smoking and filming us. Well, yes. And? Can we get up? Let's check what we recorded and if there is any sound. You can also hear that they have very serious doubts about how and whether to report this situation at all. One thing is certain, they knew that the media around the world would inform about it in a minute. And indeed they did. We approached the place where, according to the President Sarkozy's plan, there should be no Russians. They had vacated it. And immediately we heard a series of machine guns. It was about 30 meters from them. When they saw a column of vehicles approaching, they opened fire. But the main point is that if anyone has the illusion that Russia is changing their behavior, let them come. They are welcome.
Let them come and see. Unfortunately, we only have...
Please come here. The man standing here with me is extremely brave.
...to come and see it firsthand.
Tenno
Janasha was the head of security of the Georgian president, Michał Saakashvili. Here's how he told the story. I remember standing very close to President Saakashvili. Together, we were very concerned about our guest's security. We tried to protect our guest and cover him from shots as much as possible. We wanted to protect him as much as possible. President Kaczynski wanted to see what had happened with his own eyes, even though all the security guards covered him and monitored the situation. He still wanted to see it himself. I still remember his eyes were very curious about what was going on. Mr. Kaczynski was a very brave man. He was a great friend of Georgia, and he was proud of it.
He was a very brave man.
Here is what Saakashvili wrote in the invitation sent to President Lech Kaczynski in a document never published before. Last month, I announced a number of initiatives that will continue the Second Rose Revolution. If our first revolution was to face the internal threat by re-establishing a failed state, our second revolution must be even more focused, because we are now facing even greater challenge coming from the outside. The contents of letters clearly demonstrate that the Polish president's visit had an obvious geopolitical dimension. The game of integrating Georgia into Western structures was on. We learned about just how important that was from WikiLeaks cables. American diplomats and representatives of the US intelligence services thus informed the US authorities about what happened that day. The Russian government has rejected allegations about being involved in the shelling of, on the 23rd of November, the column of the Georgian and Polish presidents, Michał Saakashvili and Lech Kaczynski, as they were heading towards a refugee camp near the border with South Ossetia. The Kremlin reversed the situation by presenting the Georgian government as the party responsible for the incident. Foreign Minister Lavrov called the incident a purely provocative one, claiming that the Georgian side had organized everything themselves, to later blame South Ossetia or Russia. Lavrov assured that no shots were fired from Russian or South Ossetian positions. Deputy Foreign Minister Karasin accused Georgia of wishful thinking in this regard. The Russian Ministry of Defense spokesperson also allegedly stated that the Russian military in South Ossetia, at a Russian base or at checkpoints, did not open fire. They also accused Georgia of provocation. Very quickly, not only in the media of the Russian Federation, but also in the Polish media, a version of events began to circulate, according to which someone else was responsible for the shooting in the direction of the President of Poland, President of Georgia, and not the Russians, who those depend on them. Krzysztof Zasada, Radio RMF. Question for Mr. President Kaczynski. You told us in the refugee village we saw that it was the Russians shooting. I would like to know how we can be sure of that. Secondly, I would like to ask Mr. President Saakashvili, why was there an order for the journalist van to overtake the presidential column? Is it true, as we know, that supposedly such an order was issued from your diplomatic protocol? That we come there in the first vehicle, specifically journalists? And thirdly, how did the Georgian journalist teams appear on the spot, since President Kaczynski says it was an improvisation that we went there in an unplanned way? I would like to start by saying that it was an improvisation from my point of view. That is, in a nutshell, I agreed to that being already here in Georgia. That's all. Concerning the question, how I knew these were Russians, from the shouts, from the fact that I heard a long time ago from Mr. President and also from other sources that there are Russian posts at this place. The Russians have not withdrawn from this area. Generally, I would like to state here very strongly that the suggestions that on the other side there were Georgian soldiers or some other armed men in order to perform some improvisation. Well, these are suggestions which I would delicately describe as largely naive. This is the situation in our country at the moment. Not our country, but in Georgia. And in our country, the situation is that already it comes to that the Polish president, not on the border, but in the territory of a friendly country, shots are fired, in the air or not, I wasn't able to see. I have already heard that this was a common idea between myself and Mr. President Saakashvili. Well, I solemnly declare that such suggestions are, delicately speaking, untrue. And speaking in Polish, they are lies. The Russian false narrative about the responsibility of the President of Georgia or the President of Poland for that the Russians fired at them moved rapidly to the Polish media and political worlds. Interestingly, it occurred through the Polish special services. At this stage, and based on the information we have, we may assume that the most probable explanation is that the situation could have been created by the Georgian side. This report and the whole situation, rather than becoming another alarming signal which could cause altering the crazy policy for the Polish authors of the reset, became a reason to include special services in the policy of resetting Poland's relations with Russia.
Resetowania relacji Polski z Rosją włączyć również służby specjalne.
All materials indicate that the host failed to carry out a number of basic operations aimed at securing the president. Certainly in the course of this incident, politics dominated the most obvious security requirements. The life and health of the President of the Republic were threatened without clear need, and that co-responsibility, as always in such a situation, is on the hosts. We will expect that no more hosts, for example the Georgian government, ever again put our representatives' security at risk. Here is how Grzegorz Kuczynski, then in 2008 an analyst at the National Security Bureau, speaks about the report that was created inside one of the Polish special services. I remember that immediately after this information about the incident at the demarcation line, really separating the separatists, South Ossetia, and the areas controlled by Georgia, our superiors simply ordered such monitoring of what the Russian media was saying about the incident. So we did some research. We checked everything that was available, of course. Russian news agencies, popular Russian portals, and so on. And of course we prepared such a report from this, indeed with the title, How the Incident Was Presented in Russia. This was the first thing. However, quite soon, we obviously received a report from the Anti-Terrorism Center of the Internal Security Agency on this incident. And, frankly, when I started reading this report, my eyes grew bigger. Why? Because actually, whole sentences were copied from Russian news agencies. Of course, not really in Russian, they were translated, simply from reporting the incident through the eyes of the Russian media. Frankly speaking, I was deeply shocked while reading this because it was inconceivable that an institution so important for the Polish state, co-responsible for security, should release something like that at all. I don't know. Perhaps there was one or another person on duty and simply copied what was in the media into the document. The problem is, they copied from the Russian media, and that is the most shocking thing.
Co było w mediach, to się przepisywało do dokumentu. No problem w tym, że przepisywali z mediów rosyjskich. I to jest najbardziej szokujące.
Generał Andrzej
Intelligence and Intelligence Services. Here's what he said about the Internal Security Agency document. When I was reading this document, I thought that actually we are probably again on the verge of some political, mental pressure, coercion, which caused the services to be unable to generate a different document, which would again be a terrible sign of who was actually in charge of these services. What kind of officers they were, I cannot imagine that an officer, a patriot, who thinks in Polish could sign such a document and submit it to their commanders. For me, it is inconceivable in general. So one can just be ashamed of this piece of the history of Polish special services. Although, when it comes to the war in Georgia, I must say it, I am not sure if this has ever been said in public. The Polish military counterintelligence, this draft of scouts, as it was laughed upon, who worked in the military counterintelligence, provided an analysis in advance, in which it was clearly stated that Russia was preparing to attack Georgia. So actually, there was knowledge of the attack on Georgia. Why am I recalling this? Because I want to demonstrate that first,
pomiędzy służbami specjalnymi, pomiędzy funkcjonariuszami w tych służbach. Mieliśmy takich, którzy potrafili świetnie zdefiniować zagrożenie i na tym napisać, podpisać to i pokazać politykom, że się faktycznie ziściło.
But we also have people who could write, as you mentioned. They are able to fail to understand what they were participating in, what was going on, and how it is possible that these are services have one coordinator. These are services where the commanders are appointed by a very narrow group of people, because the heads of services are actually appointed by two people in Poland, either by the Prime Minister or the Minister of Defence, but always in agreement with the Prime Minister. And thus we may deal with two special services, which work as though completely on different grounds. In another reality, they seem to perceive facts completely differently. One knew perfectly well that there would be a war, and the others failed to understand what was going on at all. Actually, they wrote misinformation in their paper, in line with the Kremlin logic. This is the only way I can accept the story written by the officers about the visit of President Lech Kaczynski back then on the border when the shots were fired at him. Krzysztof Bondarek, the then head of Internal Security Agency, tried to demonstrate who these reports are going to at this press conference. All the services that participate in the Anti-Terrorist Centre and the top state officials, being the President, the Prime Minister, head of the National Security Bureau, Minister of Defence, Minister of the Interior. If we could display a sample report, you will see the distribution list. Ladies and gentlemen, situation report. Here you are, a sample situation report and its distribution list. The staff here are a bit nervous because there have never been so many media here. But in a moment, to the best of my knowledge, other than browsing some portals, no media have ever been here before. Here's how Jarosław Kaczynski referred to the incident and the report at the time. The Internal Security Agency cannot in one day have any grounds to declare anything on the matter. So briefly speaking, this is simply a political decision. However, the most shocking reaction were the words of the then Speaker of the Sejm, Bronisław Komorowski. If that was an assassination, I would say, like the visit, like the assassination, because it takes a blind sniper to miss a car from 30 meters. So it seems rather like something very frivolous, albeit sad, because it puts the Polish president in a rather uncomfortable situation, and a provocative situation for bad speech. Because such a quick accusation is made by the Russian side, no one knows on the basis of what grounds it undoubtedly will have an impact on the political situation and relations between Poland and Russia. Well, unfortunately, at the time we are dealing, which is also a great topic for good scientific research, we were dealing with a very sharp information campaign carried out against President Lech Kaczynski. It was very brutal, at times primitive. It did not require much finesse at all. It was a large group of journalists and politicians who, in Poland, laughingly took up various theses put forward by the Russian disinformation services, including, among others, surely Narashkin's SVR, which must have somewhere been behind preparing these theses. They were thrown into the media, such as the famous association, Cowboy Visit of President Lech Kaczynski. A somewhat sad reality, because on our side it is also worth saying that we keep approaching this issue, which I have not described clearly yet. But on our side, there is no institution which would take on the fight in the information war that the Russians wage. They have a department both in the civilian intelligence and in the military intelligence, such as the GRU, which has a special department that deals with and also directs disinformation on a strategic scale in the area of defense. On our side, we have never shaped any structure that would approach it professionally and deal with it for years, because you really need mechanisms and teams which work with certain phenomena for years, these phenomena that you need to watch. You have to work like a scientist on all of it with great passion, with scientific apparatus custom-built through which we are able to observe this phenomenon, describe, analyze and formulate some recommendations. How to deal with all of this. We are gravely missing such a tool. Among the documents summarizing this visit at the Foreign Ministry, there is also a letter signed by President Kaczynski. It is a brief but meaningful summary of this visit. It is an official letter to Georgian President Michał Saakaszwili. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to participate in the celebrations of the 5th anniversary of the Rose Revolution, which took place on the 23rd of November this year in Tbilisi. Our common expedition to the area of Akhal Gori allowed me to see firsthand the status of fulfilling the Sarkozy-Medvedev peace plan. I will relay my experience from this visit to our partners from the European Union. A memo after conversation with representatives of the Russian side is drafted on the 10th of December 2008 from the Foreign Ministry in the Eastern Department. Poland asked the Russians what they knew about the issue. In this document, the Russian Federation openly admits that shots in the direction of the column of the President of Poland and the President of Georgia were fired by representatives of the South Ossetia. That is, an entity 100% and completely dependent on the Russian Federation. Director Tarabin informed me that, to the best of knowledge of the Russian Federation, the presidential convoy and the van with journalists stopped at some distance from the South Ossetian post. However, the preceding vehicle of the Georgian security detail drove closer to the station, creating an impression that they wanted to drive further towards Akhal Gori. The car came to a halt only when the South Ossetian soldier fired 2 warning shots into the air. According to Tarabin, there were no Russians in the area of the post at the time. The Russians gave a description of these events completely coherent with what this pro-government propaganda presented in Poland at that time. That is, the whole blame for the fact that the South Ossetian soldiers, absolutely not Russian ones, used their weapons, that they fired 2 shots. It was the fault of the Polish president and the president of Georgia, who, in a way, came too close to the South Ossetian posts. That, in some sense, their reaction was adequate and rational.
treść takiego jednego na pewno z
The
kilku
contents
dokumentów,
of one of a few such documents,
które z
which
jakimś
were
rodzajem
part of an inquiry by a Russian diplomat, was of course sent to the Foreign Ministry headquarters, and one could say that Radosław Sikorski and Donald Tusk had proof that they were telling the truth in the Polish media.
Sikorski i Donald Tusk mieli dowód na to, że mówią prawdę w polskich mediach. Oczywiście śmieję się, ale to jest w gruncie rzeczy po prostu
The story is,
historia
in its essence,
całkowicie
absolutely tragic.
To była
It was crude anti-presidential propaganda campaign of the Polish press, the Polish media.
Polskiej prasy, polskich mediów. W zasadzie można było odnieść wrażenie,
One could get the impression that
że
those
ci,
who mocked the
którzy
Polish
szydzą z
president
polskiego prezydenta, w
fired
kierunku
shots
którego
in his direction were
padły
sorry
rosyjskie
that he had not died there.
strzały, żałują, że on tam nie zginął.
Kiedy jesteś blisko wszystkich naszych myśli, staje się realne to, co nam się przyśni, i wszystkie słowa wypowiedziane.
The next opportunity is to inform the world about the way the Russian Federation acts were no longer to concern merely Georgia. A few weeks later, in Davos, Switzerland, the issue of the reset entered a new level. In Switzerland, Prime Minister Donald Tusk and Prime Minister Vladimir Putin meet again.
Władimir Putin.